I'm excited to speak with Dr. Karletta Chief, hydrologist and professor at the University of Arizona. She's the director of the Indigenous Resilience Center, and she also led the National Science Foundation funded Indigenous Food, Energy, Water, Security, and Sovereignty Training Program, or IndigiFuse. Karletta is Diné and spent her early years on the Navajo Nation and brings both her personal and academic expertise to her efforts to help build resilient and sustainable solutions for Indigenous communities. So, would you start us off by sharing what was the catalyst for you to start your scientific career?
Great. Thank you. Yes. Hello. Wonderful to be on this podcast and wonderful to meet you, Jess. My name is Karletta Chief, Yate, as we say in Navajo or Diné, which means all is well. And I want to just go ahead and introduce myself in my own language. Yate, Sheya, Kodachbit, Nishna, Dol, I am Bitterwater, born from near the water, and that's how I identify myself as an Indigenous mother, scientist, woman. And I entered into the scientific field mainly because of my upbringing on the Navajo Nation. I was born and raised in a remote area of the Navajo Nation and grew up there without electricity or running water. My family lives within the Peabody Leafville area, which is a coal company that mined coal and uh, used a transportation system where they grinded the coal in and basically pulverized it and transported it via water. And so growing up in that community, I saw a lot of the environmental impacts from coal mining, such as water contamination, land degradation, air pollution, and also health impacts. And then also just human rights in general, the forced relocation of my relatives, my grandmother, my own parents, and how they went through those impacts and yet they didn't have a voice in the fact that their coal was being mined in their community. And I became very concerned about it at a young age and wanted to go to college to understand environmental science, environmental engineering, so that I could use this knowledge and information to help my own community.
Wow. So your motivation is deeply personal, is what I'm getting from that. And I'm sure you have that academic curiosity that drives all of us who go into the sciences too. Just why, how do things work? Why do they work? And something you mentioned about being in close proximity to coal mining, it actually is a great segue to starting to talk about environmental contamination, which is something that's been in and out of the public's consciousness. For several decades. Obviously the coverage of the Cuyahoga River fire in Ohio in 1969 is kind of it was an impetus for a lot of environmental topics to be brought front and center, and created the EPA as a result. So I wanted to ask you then, could you explain why it is that we're still seeing calls to clean up waterways 50 years after that sort of wake up call?
Yes, I think for my particular area, I am a professor at the University of Arizona, and I work specifically with tribal communities in the area of the environment, and specifically my own expertise is the water. And so for many indigenous communities, they have faced and experienced a lot of environmental injustice through the centuries. And it comes about from racism, colonizations of their land, and particularly with mining on the Navajo Nation, there's over 500 abandoned uranium mines. Anywhere to small, smaller mines to like larger mines, and that comes about because of the need for uranium during World War II for nuclear energy and creation of the nuclear bomb. So during that time, there was a big effort to extract uranium, and it was done very quickly, and a lot of policies were not in place to protect the environment, as well as tribal sovereignty was challenged and taken advantage of. And so as a result, the Navajo people are left with a lot of abandoned uranium mines locally. And, it's just pretty common for us to know somebody that has been impacted by cancer, or is dealing with it now. And that's just uranium. Then, of course, you have coal, you have oil, natural gas. The Navajo Nation specifically has a lot of natural resources. But in general, for the United States, tribes do have a significant portion of these natural resources on their tribal lands that have been sought after for extraction. And so through, the century, they have been impacted in a very negative way, where natural resources extraction has resulted in not only environmental impacts that have often gone unregulated, but also has caused not only health impacts, but also social and mental impacts to the people. And so that history of extraction from, the late 1800s to, almost the 1970s, not only occurred on the Navajo Nation, but also upstream in Colorado. And so you just have this whole maze of underground, mining canals that are there, tunnels, I'm sorry, that are there. And as, the groundwater rises, uh, it'll fill those, hollow, mine tunnels. And then that's when the geochemistry starts again, in that, it'll begin to dissolve what's in the rock there and cause acid mine drainage. And so, more recently, I was able to work with my team on the Gold Key mine spill, which released 3 million gallons of acid mine drainage into the Adamus and San Juan rivers. So there are hundreds of mines in Colorado alone that are basically awaiting time bomb for something to happen. So that's basically what we're living with today.
Yeah. So it seems like the the consumption practices that we have in the 21st century, and also some of them from the 20th century or the 19th century, that has all we've built up a lot of problems, and we haven't gone about rectifying them. And so that's where I'd like to start talking about the NSF program that you just led for the last 6 years, Indigifuse. Um, Obviously, it focuses on Indigenous communities. So I wanted to just I think I know the answer, but I want to check. So do we currently see large differences in the way food, energy, and water are dealt with or not dealt with on Indigenous designated lands? Mm.
Yes, I'm really excited to talk about Indigenous use because it's something I'm very passionate about. That actually came about through our work through the Gold Key Mine Spill project, and that not only were we getting a lot of students from Indigenous communities that were interested in helping out because they felt so passionate and desire to help in this environmental catastrophe, but also non-Indigenous students that wanted to participate. And many students in environmental science are of the mindset that they want to make a difference in the environment, protect the environment, to protect people's health. And so connection to community is something they really long for. But when it comes to Indigenous communities, you can't just go in there without having any training or preparation, orientation. And so when we went to work in the Navajo communities, I personally had to sit down with my team, orient them, give them some training, some tips. What are things you shouldn't do? Um, how do you how do you conduct yourself in Indigenous communities? What are things you shouldn't say? What kind of cultural protocols are there in terms of dress? things like that. And then also engaging our community partners to also do some teaching from the cultural and spiritual perspective as it relates to traditional knowledge. So we did this as we were working in those communities. And from that, we were able to involve and work with 100 students in the Bokeh Mindfield project.
Wow.
Half of them were Native American, which is very significant. And they worked in all different phases of our project, from working in the lab, processing soil samples, water samples, operating laboratory equipment, field sampling, training tribal college students, and writing up extension bulletins, developing videos. So anywhere from undergraduate tribal college students, undergraduate researchers to masters and PhD students. And so from that experience, we realized that there needs to be a training program where we're able to train students on how to work with Indigenous communities, and where no other place is the best place to do it, or one of the best places to do it, is the University of Arizona, because not only are we land grant university, we have extension, we have many Native American centers of excellence like the Native Nations Institute, and Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. So we have a significant number of Native American programs here to collaborate with and to build this program. And so we got the award, and we focused it on food, energy, and water systems, mainly because, when you talk about environmental impacts, it connects to all these systems. It impacts the ability to grow food. It's definitely connected to energy and then water. And so we centered around that so that it could be more holistic. And we also wanted to put the people at the center of this effort. So the people and how they're impacted, their rights, their culture, their sovereignty. And through this program, we were able to train students how to work with Indigenous communities in a, a multi-faceted way, where they would get coursework, they would get seminar, they get one-on-one training in the academic setting, but also they would go into the community. They would be immersed, and they would spend anywhere from a week to 2 months in the community being immersed. So we did that during spring break. We also had students that did summer internships there on the Navajo Nation. We also worked with the tribal college, the Neck College, and the students learned how to teach and be able to teach tribal college students and develop curriculum on a food, energy, water system. And then we work with the community partners and working at the chapter houses and engaging with Navajo citizens. And then each of these students talked about how one would go and ethically work with tribal communities along the areas of research. So some of our students did do research with tribal communities, and then some learned about how to do research and presented a way that their research was important or applicable to tribal communities. So through this work of working with 40 students, we worked with a variety of communities, a number of tribes, depending on the students' connections, their mentors, and then also our team. So we had a student that worked on the Crow Nation, working on the Little Bighorn River, looking at water contamination of the Little Bighorn River. We had students that worked on developing sensors for Navajo farmers at the greenhouse. We had students working on developing off-grid water systems for remote Navajo communities. So I think it definitely made an impact, a positive impact to those tribes, those tribal partners that we work with, those communities. and the students were trained in the process of doing that work and working with communities. But we still have a long ways to go. You know, my program is just one small program in a whole sea of tribal communities and needs across the United States, much less across the world.
But I mean, it's essential to start the work. I mean, it's got to start somewhere. And when I was reading up for talking to you, and I was preparing um, about the Navajo specific partnership, I saw that 35% of Navajo nations don't have electricity or potable water. Navajo Nation households, I should say, don't have electricity or potable water. And you mentioned that you grew up not having access to those things in your home. It just seems criminal in an age where we've based so much of our society on the assumption that people have reliable internet connections and clean water from the tap anytime they want it. So, in your experience, professionally, personally, otherwise, what has been the most effective at moving the needle towards clean water access for Indigenous people, both in the Navajo Nation and other Indigenous communities?
I think what has moved the needle is collaboration and inter community, tribal working groups where we come together with our resources, our work, the data that we have to be able to all just work together and bring our resources. And I think one of the best examples that I've been honored to be part of during the COVID-19 pandemic was the Navajo Nation Water Access Coordination Group. And, you know, during the pandemic, some of these disparities related to access to clean water, food, and energy were even more amplified, as well as brought to light. Many of us who are working in the communities and are from these communities know that this exists, but COVID-19 brought a spotlight on it, and especially with the funds that were being made available, like with the ARPA funds, and how quickly they needed to be spent. And so the Navajo Nation created this water access coordination group that involved universities, nonprofits, interagencies like state, federal entities, and tribal entities come together and come up with a plan, provide data to how we can prioritize getting water to the people. So, in addition to that, I also feel like the grassroots organizations are very active, very productive. They're very committed, and they know the people, they know the community, so they know how to get things moving quickly. So I've been working with the Growth Solutions as well, and also Digby, and also other informally organized community groups that know their needs the best. They're the experts, and working with them to really get these systems out there and running.
That's it's so fundamental, but it's refreshing to hear. It's just collaboration is one of the biggest things. Is people need to talk to each other and work together. And I actually recently interviewed a community activist up in Oakland, and she's a member of the African American community there who deals with a lot of port pollution issues from the Port of Oakland, Port of West Oakland. And she said, you know, you have to know how to ask the right questions. And in order to get that, you have to have good data. You have to, and you need science to undergird what you try to do in terms of changing policy. And so, one of the solutions that I read that you've worked with is deploying nanofiltration water systems in the Navajo Nation. So, can you geek out a little for us and tell us about that technology and who maintains it, who funds it, and just sort of all about those? Because I think that's fascinating.
Yes. So before the pandemic, through the program Indigenous Youth, we presented this concept of an off-grid solar-powered water system where not only is the water being treated on site in a remote location using solar, but also that the brine coming off of that treatment system could be used to water a greenhouse, which is also off grid. And the greenhouse is a controlled environmental agricultural system that is using sensors to create optimal growing conditions within the greenhouse. That was our vision. And with that vision, we would be able to train students, do research in all of these areas, and at the same time, working with the goal to meet the need for access to food, energy, and water. And so we were primarily working with the tribal college, which is the neck college, in a training and capacity building effort and building a very large system, which is a unit that sits on a trailer bed and would be able to provide water for up to 5 families based on a usage of 30 gallons per day. And so that was the system that we built that was led by Robert Arnold, Kim Ogden, and Vicky Carnicola. And then when the pandemic hit, the Navajo Nation actually reached out to us. So we never went in there offering, the system. They actually reached out to us because they were familiar with the work that we were doing within that college. And they asked us, can you design a system that is just for the home? Because at this point during the pandemic, we're talking about stay-at-home orders, limited interactions with people. And this was very challenging because the Navajo people are a very culturally community, big family oriented people. And so now you're asking people to be just at home, stay at home within your house. And so they wanted us to downscale the system and be able to pilot in different communities, and the communities all had different types of water sources. So we've been working with piloting these systems, partnering with the Squirrel Solutions, and as part of that, we really entered into this phase called co-design, because for us, our first effort is to just listen to the people, listen to what their concerns are, listen to their questions. And that's what we call community-based participatory research, where the questions are coming from the people, and they're posing those research questions. And then from there, enter into this equal partnership, and specifically to this off-grid um, solar nanofiltration water system. That's where we entered into co-design, because their technicians know what is needed because they're so familiar with the people, the user, who's going to use it, and then also benefits them as well in terms of workforce development, obtaining more types of skills. And so we worked with them to co-design it during the pandemic. And then they were the ones that identified the families who we would work with. So then the families also became part of the co-design, because every time we would visit them, they would tell us, this doesn't work. This design doesn't work. This part of the system is malfunctioning. So in that sense, there was then 3 designers in the process. And then once we got to a prototype, then we brought it out to the chapter level, which is the larger community, and shared it with the leaders and the community there. And then again, that's when we also were able to get some feedback. So for each of those piloting, we needed to understand the water quality of that region. And so we did a lot of water sampling. And so we ended up with 2 different designs. One which has the membrane that removes contaminants of concern like lead and arsenic. But then there were communities where that wasn't an issue and their water quality was pretty good. And typically those were communities that relied on springs. And for those, we're mostly just focused on disinfection. And we use the UV disinfection to treat those waters.
Wow, and I think it's so amazing that it's not just like community informed solutions that you're working on, but it's community driven. And I think that's essential because in science it's historically been, "Oh, I feel like studying this question. Let me go do it," without consulting any people who might be in the area or impacted. And I think it really reframes the approach we need to have for doing solutions-based science, and solutions-motivated science, especially with the challenges we see from climate change. So, I wanted to then ask, which ties right into climate change, what are the main issues around water security, particularly in the arid southwestern regions, like where the Navajo Nation is, and of course where you've done a lot of your work? What are the most pressing things we need to be paying attention to?
Yes, I think for the Southwestern tribes, definitely water access is a pressing challenge with climate change. And I had the opportunity to work with a big interworking group early on when I was involved in the national climate assessment. We quickly found out that there's not a lot of information when it comes to tribes and how climate change will impact tribal waters. So we did a bird's eye assessment, looking at 5 regions across the United States to identify the most pressing climate impacts to the tribes, and specifically for the Southwest, which has continued to become more and more pressing, is water access, and specifically the definitions, the defining tribal water rights, especially with the Colorado River declining rapidly. And there are tribes that still do not have their water rights defined. And what does that mean now? Like with declining water in the Colorado River, will the tribe still get how much they had wanted to get? And so there's a lot of um, tribal water law that's involved in that, which I'm definitely not an expert in, but have seen it come forward and develop more into this very pressing topic. And at the same time, for many Native Americans, water is very sacred. Water is life. And when you're talking about tribal water rights, a lot of times you have to quantify, you have to put a number to it. And, and that's where it gets very hard because, uh, many tribes don't want to commodify water and they want to keep it, in place for the environment, for cultural, uses as well as spiritual uses, and then and be able to revere it as they have done for a long time. So I think defining tribal water rights, water access, because there are many people who don't have access to water, and then also water quality because the water sources that they do have access to may not be potable, or may not be suitable for agricultural uses. So, water quality is, pressing challenge. And then for some communities, that water quality is changing because of climate change. And so, water infrastructure becomes an issue as well because their water treatment, facilities may either not be there. And if they are there, they may not be, able to treat the waters because they're changing in water quality. They may be poorly maintained. And then just water, where water is changing, with the floods, like in Alaska. melting permafrost, melting glaciers, where water is, and when it arrives is changing as well, in addition to water quality changes. And so things are moving really fast when it comes to water and how water is being impacted in tribal communities.
So that also makes me want to ask a little bit about we've discussed security, but what does water sovereignty and food and energy sovereignty, what does that look like for Indigenous communities?
Yes, that's a great question. And it goes back to the rights of the people in Indigenous communities. They have a sovereignty that needs to be recognized. And in one sense, you can think of the sovereignty as it relates to the tribe being a federally recognized tribe and their rights to senior water rights. So that's one example of sovereignty where the sovereignty of the federally recognized tribes are related to their water rights based on the date that the reservation was created. And oftentimes that date is senior, very senior to many water users in the basin who have been using the water actively and likely longer than the tribes themselves. So going back to that water sovereignty is related to the tribe's right to water rights. And then in terms of food sovereignty, we're talking about uh, many tribes have a history of their own food that they have grown. However, because of colonization or relocation, they may no longer have access to that water or to grow that water. I mean, sorry, they may have no longer the ability to grow those foods because their water has been taken or their land has been taken. And so there's the food sovereignty that's associated with their own cultural food. And then the right to grow those foods, to maintain those foods. For example, corn is an heirloom seed for many tribal communities, and these seeds have been passed down through generations in many communities, tribal communities, and they have a right to their food. That's their sovereignty that's associated to that. And then finally, energy sovereignty is the right to have clean energy, the right not to use fossil fuels, whereas many tribes have been forced to pay the price of extraction of fossil fuels. So we want to recognize that sovereignty for each of those aspects of the fuse nexus.
Wow, that's a heavy lift, I think, especially with all of the considerations from the colonial past that what this country is very much enmeshed in, I guess is probably the best way to put it. We were founded through colonization, so here we are. And other existing nations had to deal with the fallout. And that is challenging. And so along that line, I wanted to know if you have any requests for our audience in terms of supporting Indigenous community resilience. How can non Indigenous people and particularly non Indigenous scientists be best of service?
I think there's several ways that Indigenous allies can be supportive and non-Indigenous allies. And the first is there are so many different grassroots nonprofits out there that are on the ground doing trauma adaptation, working on food sovereignty, as well as energy and water security. So I would just go online, Google, and find one that you feel attuned to that you can support financially. Because I think supporting them goes a long ways in the work that they do. And then secondly, for scientists out there is basically being aware of the challenges that face Indigenous communities, and that means just being informed, reading, doing some training on how to work with Indigenous communities. And I think some of the key tenets of working with Indigenous communities include the ethics in making sure that you're you're being respectful, working with the community, that we're steering away from helicopter research, but rather listening to the communities and involving them before any effort, any kind of grant comes through, and making sure that the research that's being done is really supporting the communities, that data sovereignty is protected for the people. So when it comes to science, is not only the ethics of doing research with Indigenous communities, but also understanding that with Indigenous communities, their perspectives are very different in that they are very rooted in the environment. Their livelihoods, their culture, their worldviews are based in the environment. So when it comes to talking about the environment, it's very real to them, very part of their identity, part of their everyday prayers, their activities, and so it's not a commodity to them. It's a living entity. So understanding that, I think, goes a long way when you are talking about Indigenous communities and how you can help them is basically understanding and respecting them.
Yeah, I think it's one of the jobs of scientists in particular, but also just people as a species. We need to keep learning and inquiring and growing. That interrogation of our assumptions is essential, especially if you want to actually be a good ally. um, and so, turning directions just a little bit, I wanted to ask, what's the most exciting or surprising area of your work now, early in 2024?
I think one of the exciting aspects of the work that I'm currently involved in is the work with the Native Youth Alliance. And the Native Youth Alliance is a step up from Indigenous youth, where we're now involving 30 different Native American organizations, tribal colleges, in this larger Western United States consortium to address food, energy, water insecurities in Indigenous communities while supporting Native Americans in their pathways to the careers or educational goals that they have, as well as developing curriculum for K through 12 students that would focus on food, energy, water systems that place based and incorporate nutrition. So it involves a lot of different people that are doing great work within their own communities and involving many different Native American students and non-Indigenous communities. And it's cascading in the Western United States. And it's just a very exciting to be part of big network.
That is really cool and actually very encouraging, because, of course, one of the things about growing older is you always wonder what the generation coming after you is going to do with the challenges that we're facing, and that's actually really optimistic, and I'm happy to hear about it, because we need optimism right now, and so I have one last sort of signature question, that I ask our guests here at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and that question is for you, Dr. Karletta Chief. Why are you concerned?
I am a concerned scientist because many of the environmental challenges that we face today are impacting Indigenous in a way that's very unique to other impacts across the world, specifically because Indigenous communities are very unique politically, socioeconomically, in terms of their connection to the environment, the livelihood, the cultural practices that they, and just the place where they are at. And so it's really important to me, and it's a big commitment of mine to work with Indigenous communities to value their ways, their worldviews, in efforts to not only protect the environment, but also to protect their health, their well-being, and their culture.
Beautifully said. And thank you so much for your time, Karletta. I really appreciate having you on the show, and I am so excited to follow your work because I think it's exactly you're ordered.
Thank you. Look ahead.